Hello and welcome back to the RJM Classic Motorcycles podcast. Over the next 6 weeks we'll be tackling all manner of things related to our chosen field, ranging from an in-depth discussion about tyres to more practical advice such as how you can optimise your control cables. This week, however, we're talking about upgrades that we do and don't recommend, and we'll also be closing the show by sharing the method we use to shorten bolts. Anyway, enough of this, let's get on with it. Right, let's start off with some upgrades that we do like. These are the sort of things that we recommend to pretty much everybody that brings their bike into us. The one we're going to start with is arguably not really an upgrade. I certainly wouldn't call it one, but time and time again we see people whose machines are not equipped thusly, and that's a proper set of chokes. Ray, why is that so important?
Well, it's important for a number of reasons, not least of which, absence of which leaves you with leaves you without a useful diagnostic aid. But it is nonetheless historically so that an awful lot of Triumphs particularly would be rebuilt without any cold start device at all. And of course people say, well, you can just tickle it. Well, no, that gives you an immediate and very crude enrichment that very quickly fades away and leaves you having to repeat the starting procedure all over again. If it was particularly a unit BSA twin, A65 or A50 of any description, if you didn't have a cold start device on it, you wouldn't be able to start it, period. And obviously those machines that will quite happily start just on a tickle and with no chokes fitted whatsoever are actually running way too rich in the first place, which obviously has implications in terms of fuel consumption, but more importantly, in the modern era with the rubbish that passes for road fuel these days, there is a constituent part of the fuel which it is actually causing plugs to foul very easily. And if you've got no choke and are relying on tickling, so an immediate over-richness, you can foul a plug as easy as anything.
Yeah, I think that sums it up perfectly, really. Only thing to say is if you are going to ignore that advice and remove chokes or not have them on your bike, be sure to blank off the holes where the cables should enter at the top of the carburetors.
Yes, and do it with the prescribed AML component with the right thread, not as one journalist told the tale in the magazine recently of banging a ball bearing into the old adjuster and peening the top over, for goodness sake. And the one point I was making earlier about denying yourself a very useful diagnostic aid, obviously, particularly in the early stages of putting a machine together and dialing it in, you may find when you're out on the road that the carburation is not responding throughout the range as it ideally might, and that it might, for example, be because the overall setup is a little weak or weak in places. And obviously, if you've got a choke, it means you can dial in a bit of richness to suit and find out if it is a weakness, how much more fuel you need or how much less air you need to actually bring the setup right. So if you haven't got any chokes, you're not going to be able to do that.
Something else that it's always worth upgrading is the brakes if you can, or not even necessarily upgrading, just making sure they're serviced properly to start off with. It's one of those self-fulfilling prophecies. I think people think, oh, old British bikes don't have good brakes, so they don't spend the time to get them to work properly. But assuming you have and you're looking at getting a bit more performance out of them, what could you do?
Well, there's all sorts of things. Obviously, one of the upgrades you can apply to some of the early Triumph single leading shoe brakes is very early on they had symmetrical brake shoes and a fixed pivot. Later on, using perfectly the same brake unit, they then went to a lead and trail shoe, obviously not to be mistaken for twin leading shoe. They went from a lead to a trail shoe, so the linings themselves are actually slightly offset on the shoes, and also to a fully floating pivot, which means the shoes are much better able to synchronise themselves with the drum than the old fixed pivot arrangement. Obviously, you see a lot of machines these days sporting twin leading shoe front brakes that would have never had them in the period. And obviously, I understand this. There were, in fact, some intermediate upgrades back in the period whereby Taylor Dow, for example, produced a twin leading shoe retrofittable arrangement for BSA called the Duetto, that was then cosmetically copied for what was later to be used on BSA and Triumph, sort of post about 67. Now, the problem with that kind of upgrade is if you're going to use the right hub and drum to go with the brake unit, that's fine. But what you very often see, for example, is a late twin leading shoe setup actually operating in a pre-twin leading shoe drum. Now, it will work and it is an upgrade, but the fact of the matter is you are only benefiting from about 2/3 of the shoe because the rest is running on where the spoke holes and spoke lands live. And you need to be a bit careful about that. So if you have got a twin leading shoe conversion, just make sure it's a fully compatible set of components. The other thing leading up to that on Triumph is that they, and this is relative to pre-unit, early unit, then middle period unit twins, where they used a single leading shoe arrangement with lead and trail on the early version. They then went to a drum which had got 90-degree spokes one side and straight on the other, as opposed to the earlier straight, which was later to become the drum that was used with the twin leading shoe. But actually, in its first incarnation, it was with a lead and trail single leading shoe setup, and you can in fact use those wider shoes intended for that setup if you're careful with the earlier setup to give you some improvement there.
Even if you're fortunate enough to have a machine equipped with disc brakes, there's still lots of adjustments you can make. You even have the option with a T140, or in your case an A65, having grafted a T140 front end on it, you have the option of going twin disc.
Well, there hangs a tale. I say to clients very often, I'm quite easily led. When a client came to us to refurbish and upgrade a T140 and was very keen indeed to go twin disc, and remembering back to my infamous Harris Bonnie, which had twin discs, albeit of an Italian persuasion, I was all too keen to oblige. But in the process, and bearing in mind by this time I'm at a fairly advanced planning stage with my personal A65 Cafe Racer project, to the point where I'd already decided I was going to use a T140 front end on it, I then suddenly thought, well, hang on a minute, if I'm doing one lot of twin disc conversions, I might as well do two. And also in the process, we're not overly keen on the fixed, big, heavy, gormless cast iron lumps that passed for brake discs on T140, T160 and so forth. So we were looking around for a fully floating and lighter alternative. And whilst there were one or two candidates about, the one we finally hit upon, and there's actually two different versions of this, which are only cosmetically different, is EBC, who produce a direct replacement disc for, T140s, T160s and the like, but it's fully floating and lightened. That, together with a pair of Lockheed Racing calipers and some sintered bronze pads, should give the Cafe Racer project some fairly awesome stopping power. And that, whilst being extreme, is what you can run to if you want to.
Just as a final note, jumping back to drum brakes, always be sure that you've got some decent cables on there. Make sure they're lubricated nicely, make sure they're a good length, not just the outer length, but also the inner length, and make sure you're not all the way up on your adjustment as well. Yeah,
we found this was particularly critical to start with on the actually on a B25 that I used as a production racer. Although you got good brakes, the feel on the lever was very spongy and very vague. And what we discovered with all of those twin leading shoe setups is if you restrict the actual overall length of the cable to the minimum that is required, you can actually firm up that brake feel a lot. And when also we were heavily involved in the last generation of importation of Enfield bullets from India, which had got the sort of Japanese copy twin leading shoe arrangement, that again, all those brakes, even when the vehicles were new, felt absolutely terrible. And we found again, literally by shortening the overall length of the cables, we could improve the efficiency enormously.
Another upgrade, I think the last one we'll talk about today, I actually don't feel all that qualified to remark upon, and that is electronic ignition. The reason why I don't feel that qualified to remark upon it is because pretty much every machine we deal with either has it when it comes in or at the owner's request has it when it comes out. So explain, if you can, what the previous arrangement is and just why electronic ignition is the way to go.
Well, again, you're right, it is the way to go, and it's pretty much a given, although we have got friends in the US who like to replicate the original systems right down to the last nut and bolt, even actually trying, in one case, to get a Tiger 100C to run properly on energy transfer. Good luck with that. And they maintain that it provides the original experience. And my reply to that is, well, if part of the original experience is continually breaking down, then I'm fine with that. Just don't do it to me. The fact of the matter is, back in the day, and I'm talking specifically about coil ignition machines for the moment, is at any time if your motorcycle ground to a halt, it was almost always to do with the mechanical ignition system. Usually condenser failure, and even if it wasn't, people always said, oh, well, we'll fit a new condenser and try that first. But obviously they were subject to wear from day one, and not even so much with reference to the actual contact breakers themselves. The heel of the contact breaker was subject to wear. And whilst going back in the day you had something passably decent for road fuel, super accurate ignition timing wasn't that critical. But of course, with the modern rubbish we have to put in the tank, it's super critical, particularly with Triumphs. If you get any pinking or detonation whatsoever, you'll have the top of a piston faster than anything. So as a consequence, electronic ignition timing not only gives you that accuracy, but maintains that accuracy, because it literally is fit and forget and nothing wears. And even if you've got a bit of wear in the bushes that support the pinion that the points or the electronic ignition operates off, which would adversely affect mechanical ignition timing, it has no similar effect on electronic timing, because of course the magnet is swiping past the coil, not lifting a set of points up and down relative to a cam. So that's a big improvement. And in terms of what is our electronic ignition of choice, I know there are a number of available. One that has been, what shall we say, increasing ground recently is Payson, but it's not that dissimilar from the Boyer-Branston system. And frankly, because I've been using Boyer-Branston for 25, 30 years, I can, if in the event of a suspected fault condition, I can interrogate the damn things within an inch of their lives, which is a luxury I don't have with the Payson, because I don't understand them that well. And in terms of reliability, I've only had, excuse me, two Boyer ignitions that caused me any problem. One literally didn't work straight out the box, and the other one was a very strange manifestation. Years and years ago, a client of ours had a tidy, just late but just pre-oiling frame A65. I can't remember if it was a Lightning or a Thunderbolt, not that it matters. But in the process of several servicing cycles, I just kind of got the feeling that it wasn't quite performing with the same crispness as it ought to. But it really only was a feeling. And on the final occasion, before I sort of managed to reveal that there was a problem with the ignition box, I was just more convinced on that particular day and interrogated a little bit further, and found actually with the strobe gun that it was actually sending out some random firings, and that's all it took. Put a new box on, and of course we're right back up to the top league again.
And they're actually surprisingly easy to fit and set up. The only thing that can be a bit fiddly if you don't have the right kit is strobe timing it. But often just static timing, you can get it done fairly accurately. The only time we would be a little bit dissuading of someone going electronic ignition is if they've got a magneto that is fitted and is working perfectly fine as is. We normally say ride along quite happily with your magneto.
If it's working reliably and only ever needs servicing, that's fine. You've obviously got a good one. The moment it starts to want major attention, to be fair, Our experience is that people who are rebuilding these units these days don't seem, for whatever reason, to be able to build the longevity back into them. And you can be back to square one a year later. One of the benefits, shall we say, with coil ignition over magneto and with whatever replacement electronic ignition system you use on a originally magneto-equipped vehicle, is that if you have a failure, you can buy new parts and swap them over straight away. Whereas such is the state of the magneto and dynamo rebuilding industry, and such is their lead times, you could potentially be off the road for 6 months just waiting for your mag to be rebuilt. So that's why I say, if you've got problems with your magneto or your dynamo, it really is time to start thinking about something more modern, albeit fairly discreet, but that's going to serve your bike well for another 40 or 50 years.
It is also worth pointing out that if you have gone from magneto to an electronic ignition, it might feel like a bit of a step backwards, that you're potentially losing the ability that even with a dead flat battery you can start with the magneto, whereas the electronic ignition won't fire if the battery is below a certain voltage, and I think that's something like 4 or is it 6 volts on a 12 volt?
4 point something, I think, but don't quote me. The other thing I just wanted to add in there before we move on, you were saying about the ease of setting up the Boyer Branston on coil ignition machines. You do get one or two where you haven't got timing marks, you haven't got the ability to strobe time it, and whilst it's easy enough to set up statically, we found, for example, on the Indian-built Enfield Bullets, when we were fitting the Boyer Branston electronic ignition to those, that actually it was quite easy to finally dial in the ignition timing, because of a little trick you can do with electronic stuff that you couldn't do with mechanical stuff. You can actually get the thing running, loosen off the retaining screws for the base plate, and actually rotate the base plate to the left and to the right, and actually let the bike tell you what it needs in terms of that fine tune of ignition timing.
Last thing to say is, if you do go electronic ignition, find somewhere nice to mount the ignition pack. There's nothing more annoying, and I'm sure you'll agree, when you find it's been just cable tied to the frame or whatever.
Cable tied to the crossbar of the frame, as you very often see with Triumphs. And the other kind of word of warning, and we may go into this subject on another occasion, is where you're tempted also to use things like Boyer Branston's own twin outlet coil. Do read the instructions, do realise and do remember that twin outlet coil unit needs quite a substantial size heatsink. And again, I have seen those cable tied to the crossbars of frames, and they seem to work, but really shouldn't. And of course, if you break down in that situation with a burnt out coil, you've got nobody to blame but yourself.
So let's move on to some upgrades that we are not particularly fond of. We should say that this is just our opinion, although hopefully we can justify it with what we're going to discuss. First off, let's talk about any kind of lead replacement methods, be it something added to the fuel or something going in the tank, or even lead-free seats, for example.
Well, the worst one of all, I think, probably, and I've found on a couple of occasions, these little mesh bags inside the tank with what appear to be lead lozenges in them. Now, I don't quite understand the chemistry by how this, these inert lumps of lead in this bit of wire meshing can actually chemically infuse themselves into the gasoline. That is a mystery to me. But what I do know is they tend to wear out the bottom of fuel tanks. Years and years ago, when we used to stray off piste somewhat, a friend wanted a BMW R90S fuel tank repainted, and in the process of blasting it, having removed this little Santa stocking of lead pellets, and then starting to grip blast it, it had made a whole patch around one side of the tank so thin that as we gently bead blasted it, it blew a load of holes in it, and it looked like a calendar. So that's a bit of a, an obvious one that you wouldn't want to get involved in. So far as any fuel additives, In fact, I had an opportunity to do quite a study on this. Like with the clandestine interruption of bioethanol in fuel, previously the lead content of 4-star particularly was massively reduced very, very suddenly. Now, it happened as part of my duties in my former incarnation in the retail motor industry. One of my duties at that time was forecourt manager, and we had specific instructions from the fuel company and from presumably government sources as specifically how far to run down our fuel tanks, so that when we got replenished with the lighter lead-loaded fuel, we would have a significant reduction of a required amount, presumably, for some legislative reason. So what that actually meant is, rather than, the reduction taking place over time, there was this sudden change, and all of a sudden, I mean, we were a franchise dealer for a major manufacturer. All of a sudden, new vehicles and nearly new vehicles were reporting all sorts of problems of pinking and detonation and other timing and fuel-related issues that we'd never seen before. I mean, even to the point where, heads were having to be changed with slightly different combustion chamber shapes to accommodate it. The particular company vehicle I was running at the time was quite adversely affected, pinking, detonation, and also dieseling when you switched off. So I had an opportunity, a perfect test case, to try every additive I could possibly find to try and dial this out chemically. And I can tell you, the study was a personal and private endeavour and went on for a fair old amount of time, and I never did find anything that was an adequate substitute.
Yes, and regarding seats that are reinforced so they can cope with the lead that's in road fuel these days, ultimately there's no need, and also it's possible, albeit unlikely, that they can fall out.
Well, right from the get-go, and bearing in mind we've had a bulletin on our website for many, many moons over this, I always felt, again, from the point of view of practical experience, that so-called lead-free seats were going to bring nothing to the party whatsoever. They could conceivably leave you out of the frying pan into the fire, in the sense that unlike the original seats in your Triumph or BSA twin head, which the aluminium material was cast around the seats and therefore they're dovetailed in and can't fall out, any replacement seats can only be a parallel interference fit, and obviously subject to the different expansion rates of the different materials, can fall out. And in point of fact, the famous Triumph 4-valve per cylinder head that was used on the, now let me think, TSS, were of that kind of construction and had got a reputation for falling out. So that's one point. The other point is, do it by all means, but don't expect your bike to cope any better with actually running on this muck than it did before, purely and simply because the so-called hardened seats are only there to prevent valve seat erosion due to the lack of lubricant effect provided by tetraethyl lead in the old fuel, which is now not present. But that doesn't make it run any better. You've got a different calorific value and a different burn with the modern fuel, that if your combustion chamber shape is a little bit off as from being ideal for that fuel, then you're going to need to make ignition timing and carburetor adjustments to get it to cope. But none of that is related to valve seat erosion. And in point of fact, lead-free fuel has now been around long enough, and we've been running these vehicles on it for long enough to know that actually valve seat recession is almost a non-issue. My understanding was that the light aircraft industry did a study in this many moons ago and discovered something that they named lead memory, which meant that any vehicle that had been run on leaded fuel, any motor that had been run on leaded fuel for a significant amount of time, actually forged some of this tetraethyl lead into the material of the valve seat, which would protect it in some cases for up to 20 or 30,000 miles before you would need to consider whether you needed to go the option of hardened seats But again, our experience is we've never seen any valve seat recession, and anybody who is still promoting replacement seats in that way has frankly got their own agenda.
Moving on, something else that we're not keen on is stainless steel rims and spokes when it comes to rebuilding your wheels. Yes, you do have the advantage that they're not going to go rusty in the way that chrome rims would, but we've heard one or two horror stories over the years, isn't that right?
Well, yes. I mean, actually, it may be a less of an issue now than it was, but with specific regards to spokes and rims, because in more recent times I have had to use stainless where I would have preferred not to, particularly on Triumphs, which very often use a butted spoke. That's to say the diameter or the gauge of the spoke is thicker towards the hub end than it is the wheel end. And some of those, if you're trying to get the thing replicated as it should be, those are the only spokes that are available. But the point is that certain grades of stainless steel can work hardened very easily. So, under certain conditions, you might find spoke breakage might be an issue that you'd hitherto not experienced. And also, we have seen stainless steel rims crack. Now, again, none of this has been a recent event for us, so that I can presume to some extent that the grades that are being used, the grades of stainless steel that are being used, are more appropriate than heretofore. But again, that's a problem with stainless steel generally. Certainly, people who choose to restore machines and festoon the things with stainless steel fasteners everywhere, must be aware that a good proportion of this stuff is cottage industry made, and what grade of stainless you're working with is not necessarily information that you have available to you. The other thing that you find with adverse material types being used adjacent to one another, obviously these things are used out on the road, they get wet, sometimes they're used in the winter, get a bit of rock salt on them, all sorts of opportunities for electrolysis. And somebody brought a wheel, a back of a Norton Dominator into me to show me out of interest, and essentially, if you can imagine the situation, the hub itself had been chrome plated. The wheel itself had then been shod with stainless steel spokes and aluminium rims, and around each of the spoke holes in the hub itself, the plating was starting to reverse plate off because of the electrolysis. So you got 40 places on the hub. Each of those entry points of the spokes into the hub now had a 3/4 of an inch area around them where the plating had just literally been chemically removed by virtue of this electrolysis.
The third upgrade we're going to talk about that we're not particular fans of primarily applies to A65s, and that is a conversion enabling it to run on a needle roller bearing as opposed to the conventional timing side bush arrangement and other things that are associated with that.
Right, and I'm going to try and be as fair and as balanced about this as I can be, but I obviously have particular views. The so-called timing side bush, main bearing bush on A10s and A65, which for years and years and years have been reckoned by the motoring press, classic motorcycling press, to be the Achilles heel of this design, and that you really didn't ought to be even taking your bike out of the garage, unless you've got this conversion already done. And nothing could be further from the truth. The needle roller conversion was first offered by Devimead. I'm assuming it was their design or adaptation originally. The mantle was then taken on by SRM, who obviously do an awful lot of good works, particularly on A10s and A65s. And I understand also that one of the originators of SRM, Steve McFarlane, in the beginning was actually working on an end feed conversion that still included a a plain bush, but that public demand pretty much dictated that he abandon that and go with the needle roller conversion. Obviously, I see the logic to it. You take away the vagaries of transporting the oil from the crankcase to the end of the crankshaft that's provided for by the timing side bush, because clearly as that wears and as the tolerance between the journal and the bearing gets larger, so you have a tendency to lose a greater and greater amount of oil before it ever reaches the big ends. So the beauty of being able to insert it straight up the middle of the timing side shaft obviously has a certain amount of appeal. My concern, or one of my concerns, is that actually if you go that route, it requires alteration of the casings, which effectively, as I understand it, can't be reversed. So in other words, if you've had that conversion done, any subsequent rebuilds that need to be done, you've got to stick with that conversion. What you're not going to be able to do is ever straightforwardly put a plain bush back in there. Now, you'd say, well, okay, having gone that route, why would you want to? And I just worry that, if at some point in the future that bearing, for example, was no longer available, then what the hell would you do? Whereas if you haven't done that conversion in the first place, in 50 or 100 years' time, any little engineering shop anywhere would be able to knock you up a replacement bush, so it wouldn't be an issue. And, recognising that everybody has their own ideas and everybody has their preferences, we sort of took it upon ourselves to provide a basic alternative. Now, one of the problems that you very often find, and one of the things that I think prompts people to go that conversion route in the first place, is the middle period of A65s used a single lip roller in the drive side, continued to use the plain bush on the timing side, but because you've now got a single lip roller where there used to be a deep race ball bearing, you've got to address the potential for end float. So, and the only way you can do it with a single lip roller is actually by shimming and by using a thrust plate. Now, they use a thrust washer on the timing side adjacent to the plain bush, which locates in this completely inadequate register actually within the timing side crankcase. And very often, when that shimming is not set up well, or when wear occurs, that thrust washer can slip its leash, so to speak, and actually do damage to that completely inadequate register. So straight away you've got a problem that you've got to find some way of retaining that thrust. Now, what I discovered was the earlier versions used a ball bearing, not a single lip roller, on the drive side, which has the benefit of actually being able to control the end float once you tighten up the nut on the end of the crankshaft that draws the crankshaft towards the drive side and tightens down the alternator stator. Obviously, that's the control for your end float. And the only thing that can cause a problem with that is if your main bearing comes loose in the case, which I've yet to see. But what it does mean is there's another option available. So if you've got an A65 where the casings have been sufficiently damaged for you not to be able to deploy the thrust conventionally, throw it away. Use a deep race ball bearing in the drive side rather than the single lip roller, and revert back to the earlier arrangement. And you say, well, why did it have a single lip roller if it didn't need one? Well, again, I can only conclude that BSA, when they went that route, were trying to solve a problem that didn't actually exist. And clearly there would be the perception that a single lip roller would have more longevity than a ball bearing, which is, arguably the case. But of course, in having to deal with the end throat by shimming, you'll then actually introduce thrusting to a single lip roller that it was never designed to take. So basically what I'm saying is their rework idea actually wasn't a whole engineering solution in the first place. And we have found years and years and years of good service and longevity through reverting back to that earlier arrangement, and so that's what we offer.
So we've spoken about upgrades that we do recommend, upgrades we're not so keen on, but let's quickly touch on a few that fall into a bit of a grey area. And to mention SRM again, this first one, on A65s, increasingly we're seeing ones that are equipped with sump plates that have an additional plug in them. And this is a fantastic idea because if you've got a bit of drain down or you just want to drain the oil in your sump for whatever reason, it means you don't have to mess about loosening off nuts, removing the plate and a gasket and a filter and another gasket, and then cleaning up all the surfaces, gluing them back up, not gluing them back up, using gasket sealant, sticking them back together. Although the concern is people, and I have no evidence of this, it's just a concern, people are doing oil changes and not removing that filter and cleaning it out properly. So if you were looking to buy one, I would feel a whole lot more confident purchasing a machine that isn't equipped with one of those because it suggests that an oil change has been carried out more thoroughly.
Yeah, it's a point, one I hadn't thought of particularly, but the other thing which is pertinent to those conversions, and to be fair, I think it was SRM that originally invented the idea, although there's lots of clones of it now. And in terms of practicality, I resisted the temptation for years and years and years to fit one to my A65, but I think I went about 8 to 10 months of not using it, and it finally decided it would drain down, and I thought, you know what, when we put it back on the road next year, I think I might have one of those sun plates added. And there, frankly, hangs the tale, in that if you think you're going to just fit one, you need to remember that your old sump plate is held on with nuts on studs. The new sump plate is a lot thicker, therefore you will be required to remove those studs and either fit longer studs or use cap head screws. But of course, not all of those studs want to come out easily. Some of them you then find in the process that the threads have been damaged and studs have been araldited in, casings have been broken up and araldited back together. So, don't think it's a pleasant half-hour job on a or half a day job on a Saturday or a Sunday afternoon when the weather's pleasant round the garage, because you could get into all sorts of trouble. So, take a measured approach if you're going to go that route.
Talking further about oil and drain down and things like that, there are a number of methods that have been employed to stop oil draining down from the oil tank into the sump. And all of these come with a bit of a warning. I mean, there's the option, of course, of having an on-off tap. Great, that's going to stop your drain down, but you only need to forget about it once. That's your
well, and that's precisely the conversation I had with our good buddy in Memphis, Tennessee, because he's got, I think it's his mildly customised Norton Commando, which has got the on-off tap on it. Yep. We were looking at having to do something similar on a customer's machine a long time ago, and I was having this conversation with Jack on Skype, and he said, well, you want to do what I've done? And then he raised the subject of this on-off tap, and I said, well, that's all very well, Jack. I said, but if you ever forget to turn the oil on, I said, you're screwed. And he admitted having done that one time and done about 10 miles and realised that he hadn't in fact turned the oil on. And to quote him directly, he said, right there, that's a bring you to Jesus moment.
As well as a tap, you could use a valve, or they call it a valve, but the concern with that is it relies on restricting oil flow, granted, only to an extent, but do you really want to be restricting oil flow?
There's there's all sorts of options in all sorts of scenarios. Where you are, if you want to, for example, going back to the tap arrangement, if you really do want to fit a tap and you're equipped with coil ignition, then you can find taps which have got ignition cutout switches built into them, so that you only ever get ignition on when the oil supply is available, and that kind of situation. And obviously, a lot of these machines have already got perfectly adequate anti-drain down valves built into them. A65s, for example, you've got a ball and spring that lives in the timing side case at the back of the oil pump, and sometimes the balls need reseating, which is a fairly straightforward process. But I mean, oftentimes when we've had machines brought to us that have got a history of ferocious drain down, it's just that somebody's left the ball and spring out altogether. Now, the A10 is a little trickier because the ball and spring is under again on the timing side, but on the inside of the crankcase is housed under this pathetically inadequate countersunk screw that's then been repeatedly punched in place, and you make a right mess of the cases actually trying to service it. So, frankly, we choose not to cause harm where we need not. But again, if there is a subsequent problem, you can use some of the proprietary anti-drain down valves. But again, you do need to be careful and know what the effect of them is specific to your particular machine. There's one, for example, on Norton Commando that is designed for Norton Commando, and it's got a specific place to live. On the Triumph and BSA triples, again, there is a very adequate anti-drain down valve which lives in a little housing. It's a spring and ball with a retainer that lives actually in the engine casing adjacent to the oil pump, so it's right where it needs to be. The danger always is if you've got an anti-drain down valve somewhere further up the line, when you do an oil change and all the oil drains out the line, when you then replenish the oil and you start the motor up and the oil pump starts sucking again, it's sucking on fresh air. So it's actually got to deal with that airlock before it can ever draw oil down the line. So very often people are, for a short period after an oil change, suffering oil starvation to the engine they've no awareness of.
Rounding off, the last questionable upgrade we're going to talk about today is sealing fuel tanks. Now, there are times when this is necessary and advised, and we use a product by a company called Caswell Plating, which we've had some good experiences with in the past, but still there are concerns, aren't there?
Well, again, and we've touched on this in the last series of podcasts. The Vintage Club years ago, who were the only authority on this subject when, before classic bikes were even called classic, used to routinely say, well, if you've got a bit of rust in your tank, just put some sealant in it. And usually it was PET seal or something similar. And of course, come the day of bioethanol, all sorts of strange things start happening. Namely the PET seal, which has been an old favourite standby for years and years and years, is now melting. The tank is now leaking again. The rust is now coming into circulation, and all this gum and nastiness is ending up in, your carburettor, your inlet track, in amongst your valve gear, and so forth. So, whilst for example, the Caswell Plating product is an overlap epoxy which is resistant against bioethanol, my reluctance for using it when you don't physically have to, in other words, not using it as routine maintenance, is because, frankly, we don't know what's coming down the pipe in terms of other adaptations and alterations to fuel that they will just add and not tell anybody about, and that might compromise, for example, the Novolac epoxy. Now, I'm not a chemist, I don't know whether that's possible or not, but I know that my previous reluctance to resort to PET seal has saved both us and an awful lot of our clients an awful lot of grief that we would have had otherwise.
Yeah, that's basically all we've got to talk about today. Again, disclaimer, these are just our recommendations. Obviously, feel free to ignore them. But I hope the things we've said and the way we've thought about these upgrades make you think in the same way. If you're looking at an upgrade, think about all the good things, the bad things, and come to an informed decision. Well, there we go. I hope that was helpful and not too controversial. Moving on, as promised, here is this week's quick piece of advice. So for this week's piece of advice, we are going to share with you the method that we use to shorten bolts. That's another one of those, and we have a lot of these with the piece of advice at the end. It sounds really like one is teaching one's granny to suck eggs, but these are all born from experiences, things we've seen. Too often we see bolts that have been very poorly shortened, and of course, there can be negative effects as a result of this.
Yeah, I mean, famously, when people have tailored cap head screws for certain applications in primary chain cases or whatever, and they've clearly just sawn the end off the screw and left, all sharp bits and burrs and what have you, and have managed to pretty substantially damage the thread as they've wound the screw in.
Yeah, and I've recently experienced this on an A50 that had a Wassel electronic ignition on it, although it did have a Boyer Branston electronic ignition on it, which was unbolted to put the Wassel on because the Boyer was supposedly no good, but when we checked the ignition timing, it was massively out with the Wassel anyway, so maybe there was nothing wrong with the Boyer kit in the first place. But that's somewhat tangential. And yes, the Allen bolts that hold the stator plate on had been poorly shortened and the threads were damaged as a result. So how do we do it? What do we do?
Well, first of all, it's worth bearing in mind that, you need some way of cleaning the thread up once you've hacked the end off it. And, of course, a quick way of being able to do that is to put a nut on there before you make the cut, and then tidy the end of the screw up on. We use a belt sander, but you can use a power file or whatever.
Just a hand file if you need to.
Yeah, to get the bottom dead flat and then give it a slight bevel. Then you can spin the nut off, thereby cleaning the thread on the way off, not trying to clean the thread as you screw it into your engine case, and then just give it a run up on the rotary wire wheel. And then you've got a perfectly shortened bolt.
Yeah, I suppose just to round that off, supposing someone has just shortened a whole load of bolts in the less than ideal manner, what should they do to try not to damage the thread of what it's going into?
Oh, sorry, I don't know what you're leading on to.
Well, I was just leading on to that if you have shortened one in a less than ideal manner, you could use a thread file or perhaps a button die to clean up the thread as best as you can.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought of that.
Sorry, I sprung that on you.
You did, absolutely.
We make notes, but really, what's the point? Well, that's all from us this week. If you like that, you can subscribe on YouTube, iTunes, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also visit our website, rjmclassic.com, or email me specifically about the podcast at rjmpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.